Oh,
Somebody suddenly
I
remembered.
forgot.
yeah. Yeah.
Can I take us back to page 49? Because near the beginning of the book, the chapter that's the call,
Yep.
and read you just that paragraph there. So it says, in attempting to trace the course of next life, we are also attempting to interpret it. And although as historians, we must deeply regret the scantiness of authenticated information on the last period of his life, we were nevertheless encouraged to undertake the task precisely because this last part of next life has become a legend, which actually I think relates to what I was saying about the mythological hero dying. We have taken over this legend and adhere to its spirit, whether or not it's merely a pious fiction. Just as we know nothing about Knecht's birth and origins, we know nothing about his death. But we have not the slightest reason for assuming that this death could have been a matter of pure chance. We regard his life, insofar as it is known, as built up in a clear succession of stages. And if in our speculations about its end, we gladly accept the legend and faithfully report it, we do so because what the legend tells us about the last stage of his life seems to correspond fully with the previous stages. We go so far as to admit that the manner in which his life drifts gently off into legend appears to us organic and right, and so on. So it's kind of interesting. Actually, with a lot of books, you read the last chapter. It's the point at which one needs to go back and read the beginning again and look for the clues.
Yeah, that's interesting. I went back to the first chapter and highlighted a different passage of the biographer talking about what it is he's doing, and I'll read that for you. Although he was not spared the perplexities of life of the mind, it was given to him to experience without personal bitterness the tragedy inherent in every life consecrated to thought. Indeed, it is probably not so much this tragedy in itself that has tempted us to delve so deeply into the personality of Joseph Knecht. Rather, it was the tranquil, cheerful, not to say radiant manner in which he brought his destiny and his talents to fruition. Granted, there is always much that is hidden, and we must not forget that the writing of history, however dryly it is done, and however sincere the desire for objectivity, history remains literature. History's third dimension is always fiction, by which I presume the first two are space and time. And so this is, this sort of acknowledgement that everything you see written down here is literature, and I've had the opportunity to make stuff up. And even in spite of the strictures within the Castalian mindset of despising history, here this person is both creating something as literature and exercising history. So both of these two things are violently opposed to what we've been told are the precepts of the Castalian lifestyle. So here he is describing it, but yet defying it from the beginning.
Maybe it's worth asking what Hesse is trying to get at about the worth of a life, or what's the ultimate goal of a human life? Because he does talk about that kind of in some of his other books too. So here we have this hero who we watch him reaching the pinnacle of what he can do in Castalia. I mean, the top would either be being Alexander, the president of the board, or being Magister Ludi, I guess. I mean, that's it. And he makes it to that thing. And he's at a young enough age where, normally people would just stay in that position until they died. That's the expectation, correct? And it's like if you're the abbot in a monastery, if you're elected when you're 55 years old, you're expected to just be abbot forever, or a pope, or whatever. Tenured professor, you become the emeritus professor. But here's a guy who says, this isn't enough for me. And it's not that he has, well, maybe there's a confusion between his ego need to do something different and the pride that eventually defeats him, with this sense of always pushing himself to go further, to move toward what he considers to be awakening. And that was what led him to leave Castalia, plus his sense of responsibility toward Castalia. He had like this personal desire to experience the real world and to do something humble where he wasn't already prepared, and where he could work with young pupils or whatever. But he also had this sense of trying to integrate. He wanted to try to integrate the two worlds to ensure the preservation of Castalia. And it didn't work out for him. He was defeated by his pride, I guess. But maybe he couldn't have lived there anyway. It's like he couldn't breathe that air. But, what the book couldn't really end with him just staying as Magister Ludi, could it? That.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it could have ended with him as Magister Ludi. I think that now that after listening to you, I think I can moderate my. By the way, the reason why I'm positioned like this today is because I'm keeping an eye out of the window because I'm waiting for a UPS delivery. So that's why I'm. So that you'll see me looking that way every once in a while when I hear a noise out there. I think you're right. It really couldn't have ended with him staying on as Magister Ludi. But I think that still the ending was so abrupt and so melodramatic even. Like I said, it smacked of a Hollywood movie. It smacked of something like Star is Born, where Julie Garland is waiting for, and he wades off into the water and kills himself, or something like that. It's just, it just didn't hit, it didn't click with me. However, yeah, you're right. I think the point of the story, from my perspective, because of my own background and what I do, is that the two worlds do not mix. And one of the issues that I have with the closest analogy that I have to Castalia in my own background, my own work is something like Mount Athos, which is a separate republic of monasteries in northern Greece. And one of the issues that I have with Mount Athos, I've been there twice, so I know what I'm talking about. But more importantly than being there, what I object to is those monks coming out into the world and going even into parishes and influencing people that they really have no business influencing, because their world, they're bringing their world, their values into the world where they're not appropriate, and they and even though Knecht does not get the opportunity to do that because his ego defeats him, or his pride, maybe that's part of the message that Hesse is trying to convey, that maybe Castalia should be Castalia and the world should be the world. And I liked Anne's comment about Tito, taking on this almost aura, and Yeah, he is like Siegfried, and just like Siegfried, he is defeated in the most ridiculous circumstance of all. Yeah, I mean, it's no, Tito is not defeated, but I don't know. I just I'm not happy with the conclusion of this book, but I agree with Beth that it is, I guess it is appropriate. The book couldn't have ended. But you set up these expectations with the passage that Greg read and Anne.
Yeah.
You set expectations of something extraordinary, and the title of the last chapter, The Legend. There's nothing legend in that chapter. I mean, most of it is a conversation between him and Alexander. And the last 10 pages, he moves out and he feels freedom and whatever. There's nothing legendary about that. I mean, what's the big deal? I think it's the expectations that have been built up by this book. That's why I prefer the first 2/3 of the book rather than the last third of the book. And I'm not counting the 3 lives and the poems as part of the last 3 books, because they're beautiful, though most of those sections that we read before. There's nothing legendary about it. What's the big deal?
Yeah, because it's not like in the lives where you can say he sacrificed himself for the good of Castalia.
Yeah.
There's nothing mythic about this.
There isn't.
That's why I was really pissed off.
The 3 lives are much more impressive than his life, quite frankly, if we take it all the way to the end. Yeah, and maybe that was intentional on Hesse's part. I don't know. Maybe he was going to do a sequel with Tito as I don't know, but I don't know. I'm just not. It left me kind of empty.
Yeah, I guess if you're 12 years, right, you have to bring it to an end somewhere.
Yeah.
It
felt
like he's sick of it, and I'm just going to kill him off.
Yes, thank you.
It did feel like that. My publisher is urging me to deliver the manuscript.
Right.
Yeah.
So I liked in his conversation with Alexander, I thought he made this analogy about what was wrong with Joseph, which I thought was really quite striking. It says, a man can be a star of the first magnitude in gifts, willpower, and endurance, but so well balanced that he turns with the system to which he belongs without any friction or waste of energy. Another may have the same great gifts or even finer ones, but the axis does not pass precisely through the center, and he squanders half his strength in eccentric movements which weaken him and disturb his surroundings. I thought that was quite interesting, although he's got the physics all wrong. All right, this is Aristotelian physics where it sounds good, but it doesn't match with if you take the time to compare it with observation. I mean, if you have the rotation of a system will always go, the axis and the center of mass will always coincide, and an individual piece of it may not be on the center, but there's no friction involved if it's out by Penny. Yeah. So the fact of something not being on the axis of rotation does not create friction, even though Aristotle may have thought so. And it would still continue predictably and periodically, or maybe aperiodically, but not without dissipation of energy. So anyway, that was both an interesting analogy and an example of how Hesse can get his physics wrong by invoking the classics rather than reality.
In that conversation with Alexander, he says in the bottom of page 399, life in the world, as the Castalian sees it, is something backward and inferior, a life of disorder and crudity, of passions and distractions, devoid of all that is beautiful or desirable. But the world and its life was in fact infinitely vaster and richer than the notions a Castalian has of it. It was full of change, history, struggles, and eternally new beginnings. It might be chaotic, but it was the home and native soil of all destinies, all exaltations, all arts, all humanities. It had produced languages, peoples, governments, and so on and so on. But in Castalia, there was nothing to nourish it. Here we were outside of the world. We ourselves were a small, perfect world, but one no longer changing, no longer growing. And of course, that's brilliant passage, and it's typical of how his own mind and view has matured in the book. But then again, it's just part, and then you're just let down. Here is the man who breaks out of that kind of unchanging, non-nourishing world called Castalia, and he goes out into the world where there's change, there's history, there's struggle, and eternally new beginnings, and so on. And he just drowns on his very first day in that world, or the day after, the morning after his first day in that world. And it's like, so what's your message, Hesse?
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, if we had a sense that this was a moment of great epiphany for Tito, and that Tito was, like in the lives, the inheritor of what connects life and death were meant to be about, and that Tito was going to go on and become a kind of integrative figure, then I'd be okay with it.
And even a transformation in Plinio de Signori, the father of Tito, and it's just not there.
I mean, Greg and I talked about this because we had a written correspondence because I was outraged about the book. And
okay.
And I was saying, well, we do see that Plinio changes, and we know that he is on a board or some kind of political representative who has power to affect the future of Castalia. So perhaps we can assume that Plinio becomes, integrates these worlds more in himself and becomes a supporter of Castalia, because here we know that Castalia has continued however many years into the future this writing is. So whatever Connect predicted about the demise of Castalia has not happened yet. But Greg and I were discussing when is the biographer writing? How many years does it take for a legend to grow up around somebody? Is this 100 years later? Is it longer than that? Is it less? We don't know. But we do know that Castalia is still there, and the glass bead game is still happening.
Students still talk about it. And people are still talking about the effect of Connect.
Yeah, and among the students, it sounds like he's considered to be this legendary figure who, hi, he represents something. He was an iconoclast. He represents something completely unique in the history of Castalia. And nobody's saying that he's considered to be, they didn't expunge his history.
Right, they said he's still controversial, but we won't go into that because it's been discussed so much, you all know. Right, that was one of the places where he refrained from telling us what we most want to know by saying, "Oh, you all know that." It's so much part of our history that I don't need to go into that.
And we do know enough about Plinio and Plinio's admiration for Connect to project how he is going to react to his death. And he's probably going to do something in his life to try to make up for it. I mean, he's going to feel responsible. So what did he do? We don't know. But Castalia is still there.
Well, he gave his notes to whoever wrote the legend, right? So he propagated his thoughts, made them a topic of discussion within Castalia, maybe more than connect circular letter to the board, having it show up as a legend to be distributed among the students would be something that Connect himself couldn't have done, but his disciples with Plinio as a central part of that conspiracy made that happen.
Victoria, we're all venting about the ending.
Tell me the nature of the vent.
It pissed Beth off. And it made Costas think he liked the first 2/3 of the book and hated the rest of it.
Not including the poems and the 3 lives.
Understood.
So what was your impression of the last bits of these
I mean,
biographies?
there was a cop-out aspect, you know, it's a different kind of Deus ex machina that he would just die, solving all problems. But I think that it touches what Beth and I were talking about last Friday, that I'm tending towards being relieved that he's just, you know, that it's just an ordinary story, while Beth is disappointed that it's an ordinary story.
Mhm.
I like always to be reminded of our clay feet and the limits of existence, etc. I feel less inadequate.
Mhm.
Whose sound is off? Somebody's sound is off, or are we just hearing background somewhere?
I think someone's speaking in someone's background.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
I blame Greg.
Penny is on a call in another room with some doors closed, but it's not totally quiet here. You may be
Okay.
picking it up on my microphone.
It's fine, it's fine. It's not intrusive. I
Sorry.
was hoping that everybody's sound was on, that's all.
Mhm.
On a slightly different topic, I was rather struck on page 412 by the phrase he uses there, "you people," which has become something we're very conscious of these days. There's been a racist kind of
As an
comment.
insult, yeah.
Yeah, so he says, "you people in the world seem to be exposed to suffering and cares." So this huge sense of alienation, though, all through the book, isn't there, between Knecht and the various other environments around him.
Yeah.
Castalia arose, I mean, it's very clear from the historical narratives, including the big conversation between Knecht and Alexander, where it's very, and the circular letter, it's very clear that what he calls the century of wars, the feuilleton age, and so on. You know, Castalia arose out of a world where there was war, where there was conflict, and just like Anne said right now, I mean, the divisions and the prejudice is, you know, has not Castelia has basically created its own perfect little world, and yet being funded and supported by the world outside, which is you people, okay, out there. And but clearly the world is still a divided world, and Knecht himself is basically saying that there's trouble ahead. You know, that when the next war comes, or the next crisis comes, the world is not going to place a priority on supporting Castelia. So it's not a world that has been transformed out of the century of wars. It's still there. The prejudice on both sides is still there. The divisions are there, and the threat of war and destruction still hangs over the world. So basically, what has been the achievement of Castelia, besides creating a separate world for a certain elite kind of people? There's nothing, this book, quite frankly, now that I think about it, there's nothing in this book that actually gives me any hope of a transformative vision, or something that could actually communicate into a real message for us living in the real world. I don't know. It's part of the overall disappointment that I have with this book.
Well, look at the real world. I mean, look at Hillary Clinton calling people deplorables who aren't educated, coastal, academic, Ivy League type people. And where we are today with the great distrust of people who have higher education, people who are considered to be elite in some way, and live in a much more rarefied and secure way from most of the people in living real lives. You know, it is possible for people still to remove themselves from a great many of the troubles of daily life, as well as the effects of history, whether it's slavery or whatever. You know, many of us have lived in a way that we are barely touched by this. So maybe Hesse foresaw some of that, but I think it's real. It's like, how do these things mix? How do they communicate? They don't very well.
Yeah. I mean, my own monastic life here in the National Laboratory System is that story, right? I mean, it was initially Atomic Energy Commission, formed out of the, Atoms for Peace, the tragedy at the end of the war. Scientists that need to do something good, and they were given by society tons of money. They set up their laboratories, their sandboxes, hired smart people, and let them do science. And I've been a beneficiary of the sort of second and third generation of this enterprise, and now the survival depends on being able to make political connections with our funding agencies, somehow convincing people that what we do is of value outside of our own intellectual curiosity. I mean, very much the same issue where the purists in the early generation, they could be totally oblivious to their connection with society, and they really did have a very rarefied intellectual existence. And then second and third generations realize that their budgets and their existence are really at the mercy of politics, and you start playing the politics games. So I mean, that transition out of a time of global stress into ivory towers, it's very much what happened in the times that Hesse was foreseeing.
And like in my own life, I mean, I deliberately chose not to go the academic route because I didn't want to live I wanted to live in the real world. And I didn't want to like be a classics professor in a university. So, but at the same time, I've always had, I'm myself. So I've always had this dual existence, or what's felt like a dual existence of trying to have a rich intellectual and creative life, but also needing to make a living and have a business and whatever. And the place where I felt like, I've always been an activist too, but to try to multiply the power of an individual, I've often tried to work through the church, because the church has a much louder voice and people gather together and they can do really good things. But there's so much inertia and so much just desire on the part of institutions like the church to preserve themselves, to preserve the building, to preserve the budget, to just keep on doing the liturgy, that they don't want to do the prophetic role. They don't want to take positions in public. The bishops don't want to like join together and make statements. And also the world has discounted that voice to some extent. So, it's been very frustrating.
To say the least.
Yeah. But, some good things also have come out of it. And it's been, I've had a really interesting life, I think. But
And is it the real world? Do you live in the real world?
well, who lives in the real world? Does a Black person in the Bronx in a project, living in one of the projects, that's the real world?
In contrast to being a classics prof.
Well, yeah, I think this has been more the real world. Sure.
Costas, did you ever explain what you meant by your harsh judgment of monastic life? Was I not there?
I don't have a harsh judgment. I think monastic life is great within monasteries. And I think that they live in a separate world. My criticism and my harsh criticism, it is harsh criticism, occurs when they try to bring out their sense of obedience and strict adherence to all sorts of rules. When they try to bring them out, and they do. And the unfortunate thing, I actually, we have about, 8 dioceses in the United States, each of them with its own bishop and so on. Our bishop, who is in Boston, is the only bishop in the entire United States and Canada who has not allowed this one monk from Mount Athos to establish a monastery here. And I've been very happy to be in that one diocese in the country that has not allowed that world to mix with our world, because they really bring in a spirit that is very anti everything. Extremely narrow-minded, which, if you want to be like that, like Castalia, you want to be elitist in your own world, in your own protected environment, go ahead. I've been up there twice. I spent 2 summers back in the early 80s. I went up there, very impressive lifestyle, very impressive buildings, quiet, serenity, spirit, and blah, blah, blah. But, that's their world. And so my harsh criticism, and it is harsh, you're right to use that word.
No, I wasn't meaning it as an indictment, as in just you had used it. That's all.
No, I am a critic because of their attempts to bring it out, to bring their sense. I have people, not so much in my parish, because like I said, we don't have that problem in this diocese, but in other parts of the United States and Canada, I know people who do not go to their own priest or their own for any kind of spiritual advice, for any kind of guidance. They just communicate with these monks on Mount Athos, and they are sometimes their rules and what is sort of beaten into their brains is extremely contrary. I mean, the rules that they are being told are monastic rules, and we don't live in monasteries. We don't fast the way monks fast. We don't pray 20 hours a day. You know, I mean, it's just a different world. And so, yeah, I criticize it when it's attempted to be brought to, no, it exists separately. And I think that's the impression that I get from Castalia. It doesn't mix.
Mm.
Well, the one things that you're saying, you're trying to find something of value in the Castalian world that can relate to the rest of us. And I think, I mean, in the discussions in the chapter 11, so say that it is treason to sacrifice the love of truth, intellectual honesty, loyalty to the laws and methods of the mind to any other interests, including those of one's country. And that so that teachers are more essential than anything else. Men who can give the young the ability to judge and distinguish, who serve them as examples of the honoring of truth, obedience to the things of the spirit, respect for language. So I mean, those I think are defensible reasons for having a Castalian society protected from but serving the rest of the world.
Absolutely, I agree with you. That's one of the things that I definitely like about that passage. And you know, you see it in the Virginia election this week. Why did the Democrat lose? Because he had dared basically to make that statement about what is being taught, and that he's not going to allow parents to tell teachers what to teach their kids. You know, the whole teaching profession, my wife was a teacher for many years, you know, is the whole teaching profession is under attack by the world, by the non-elitists.
Mm.
There's an attack against all intellectualism.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the underside of the world, you know, so that, you know, so we can criticize the elitists, whether it's monastic or Castalia or whatever, but then there's a huge undertow in the world that seems to just want to reject everything that's intelligent and everything that is intellectual. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm a snob myself in the eyes of many because of my own tastes in music or what I do, what I read, what movies I watch. I guess I'm a snob, and some people probably think I'm a snob whenever I make references in one of my sermons, let's say to Bach or Wagner. Okay, I mean, I'm sure some people might think of it as elitist, as snobbish. That's out there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's impossible to avoid that if you've had this kind of education and whatever. It's like, I mean, where I grew up is rural upstate New York, and it's Republican, and most of the people there have not had 4 years of college, and they're very mistrustful of people who might look down on them or think that somehow their life of hard work in a factory or on a farm or whatever is somehow lacking. And when you leave and you get an education and you do whatever you do, you live in a city, you listen to classical music, whatever it is, then you are no longer trusted. You're no longer trusted by those people. I mean, this is what I've experienced in my own family. So, but by the same token, I understand where they're coming from because I grew up there. And, you know, these are people who have They're dealing with the opioid epidemic. They're dealing with factories that have closed. They're dealing with a lifestyle that's deteriorating and feeling like nobody listens to them and nobody in power understands. You know, Hillary Clinton was their senator. It didn't work out real well. But it's the same thing. So if the elites are so removed that they can't have compassion and they can't communicate, what is the use of the elitism? It's
but there is something where the American model is perplexing, is that there have been so much history of that populace voting against its actual self-interest. You know, that and there really have been such misinformation campaigns where it's like, if white racist golf playing millionaires vote for Donald Trump, I'm not perplexed by that. Okay, go. But that people who, you know, I remember going to a talk a couple of years ago where there was a guy talking about meeting a man who on his very beat up truck had a sign that said lower taxes, that had a bumper sticker that said lower taxes. And he went to talk to him, interview him, and this man had a good year the year before where he made $18,000 in a year, where all the taxes paid would be to his benefit. You know, with all the taxes in the whole world that anybody would pay would be to his direct benefit. But the propaganda that taxes are our biggest problem, rather than lack of social services being our biggest problem, had completely reached him. He really believed that the problem was that he paid too much in taxes, that everybody paid too much in taxes. There is something perplexing, difficult to understand.
You're right, propaganda, and people end up voting against their best interests. And that's what the example you just used. And that's very common of a lot of people who vote Republican. But they are repelled by what they see in the Democrats, you know, and where they're more concerned with identity politics and with, gender issues and stuff like that than they are. And then when they do try to pass something that benefits the people, it's blocked by a filibuster or whatever. And so people just despair, and then they fall right into the hands of a populist like Donald Trump. It's a very depressing situation.
Yep.
But sometimes when I hear people say this is why Democrats are failing when somebody takes up a rarefied issue and makes it a big deal, and I'm like, well, that and Putin, you know, I mean, that and the campaigns all over the world for disinformation. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, what I'm left with after today, I was disappointed by the end of the book, but it kind of ties in with, I guess, the depressing picture that we live in. You know, I don't know. Maybe there it was no magic. What's the word? Magic bullet or whatever magic button that Castalia could. We never hear much about the teachers who go out, though. I mean, because one of the things that Castalia does is they do send out teachers to teach in the schools of the world. And of course, that's how Knecht, of course, had that kind of a goal set in front of him as well. And we don't hear much about those folks.
No,
except that they're out there.
And they're all men. What do we make? I mean, at the end of the book, Knecht leaves a kind of final testament. He on a scrap of paper, he writes down the words of this poem, which Plinio keeps. So that's kind of a little scrap of historical evidence, if you like. And the poem is, our days are precious, but we gladly see them going, if in their place we find a thing more precious growing. A rare exotic plant, our gardener's heart delighting, a child whom we are teaching, a booklet we are writing. And that's kind of what he's, it's what he hoped to do, to teach Tito to write a book. But, man, what's the phrase? Man plans, God slaps him down. I can't remember the exact quotation, but, he has this wonderful idea, but in one moment of stupidity, it all comes to an end because he kills himself.
Maybe this is the book that Tito wrote.
Maybe. I
Maybe
still
he's
think
the
Hesse was going
biographer.
to follow it up with something about Tito.
Yeah, no, I was wondering whether Tegularius was the biographer.
Yeah, it's possible.
Well, clearly our discussion today has shown that even though most of us are disappointed by the end of the book, what I think we have, most of our discussion has revolved around, especially in the last, let's say, half hour, has revolved around how relevant it is and how it does accurately reflect not just Hesse's time, but even our own time. And it's, it's not a very joy-inducing picture.
Well, I would imagine that, being in Switzerland in the 30s and early 40s wouldn't have been a very pleasant time in terms of your outlook on the future of humanity would have seemed quite depressing, I can imagine. Maybe worse than now.
Better place to be than other parts of Europe.
Switzerland, certainly, but I guess the
Yeah,
question.
I mean, that's almost the Castalia with Nazi Germany being the world.
Yeah, so I think he certainly was feeling, or I can imagine that he would have felt himself in this privileged ivory tower of a isolated, ineffectual, intellectual community of literary scholars at a time when something needed to be done.
Yeah.
But what could you do other than walk out across the border and get shot?
Well, those are always the choices for the intellectual. What do you do? And it seems like Hesse is saying, well, what you don't do is put your head in the sand. You make some kind of a stand. You try to grow. And maybe it doesn't work out for you, but maybe what he's saying in that little scrap, that little poem, is that you have planted a seed. Maybe he did plant a seed in Tito. He tried, and he made a testament that has gone down in Castalian history, where somebody said, there's more to it than this. So that's not so bad, is it? It seems to me that living an unexamined life where you're just like playing your Purcell sonata and you're reading your books and never thinking or never mixing with the rest of the world, that can be criticized.
In his final conversation with Tegularius, he remembers the poem that he himself wrote, which is on page 444. It's one of the last, it's a second to last. poem in the poem section called Stages, which he had originally titled as Transcend.
Mm.
And he kept on, and this in all beginning. It's interesting how that poem ends. We must prepare for parting and leave-taking, or else remain the slaves of permanence. Even the hour of our death, which sounds very Buddhist, even the hour of our death may send us speeding on to fresh and newer spaces, and life may summon us to newer races. So be it, heart, bid farewell without end. I don't know, it's
Yeah, so he may have left an intellectual legacy more effective than his actual life, which in a sense is fitting if he's leading a life of the intellect and not so much a life of action. If his legacy is a legend rather than a life.
Mm.
So basically, yes, I think that's a very good point. And so basically the end maybe is meant to be open-ended. So we don't know what the future of Castalia is, and we don't know what his lasting influence, and maybe that's why his life is still called a legend, even though it didn't fit our maybe expectations of what a legend should be. But maybe that's precisely it, that it's his influence on the glass bead game, on the, I mean, Alexander was clearly impressed with his conversation with Knecht, even though he was already treating him as an outsider. He was already treating him as a visitor. Basically, he was already not one of them. But we don't know what his lasting influence was, and why is he still remembered decades or centuries later as a legend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe his influence transcended his physical existence, and I think that's probably the most optimistic way to look at it. Did Castalia change? Did it become less of an elitist other world? We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's hope.
Good.
Yeah.
maybe not quite as.
I'll take that as a motion to adjourn, Costas.
All right, let's do it. Let's adjourn.
So next week.
Next week, we'll play some games. Is that okay? I know Vivian wrote to me saying that she hoped to share some homemade videos with us, and that she hoped to be through her rough spot right now with her friend, and will join us then. I'll have something, and I guess yeah.
I'll have something somewhat cynical, but yes.
Okay, that's in the appropriate spirit of the game.
Exactly. My feeling of what the essence of this game is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I say if the rest of the group can be here next time, maybe we can have some general comments in addition to our fun and partying. Okay.
And then what do we read next?
Well, we were thinking we should just do something short as a
over the holiday season.
For the holiday season, maybe get ready to start something heavier for December. But either I know Beth had mentioned that The Dead by Joyce is a long short story, or maybe
Which
a couple.
one? Sorry, Greg.
It's called The Dead.
Oh, I don't know
James
that one.
Joyce.
I haven't
Yeah.
read it. James Joyce. I haven't read it. that would be interesting. I also was wondering whether we could do one or two Jorge Luis Borges stories. They've come up from time to time in our discussions, and those are short and available online. Something that wouldn't require continuity of whoever might need to be away for holidays.
Maybe we could do both, Greg.
Yeah, maybe
We could devote 1 week to the Joyce story and 1 week to, say, 2 Borges stories.
Yeah, that sounds good. So why don't we do the Joyce first? I think you should be able to find it, The Dead. So this will be 2 weeks from today. Maybe we'll have a look at the Dead by James Joyce.
It's in the book called Dubliners, which is
okay.
his book of short stories. But I think you might be able to find it online.
Mm-hmm.
I can get it from the library. Yeah, I'm thinking of, I mean, you're thinking of Thanksgiving, I guess, it's the holiday season. I'm thinking of December more, it's the holiday season. So I'm thinking I'm not really going to be ready to plunge into War and Peace until January, but that's just me.
Mm-hmm.
Other people might not agree.
I don't know. Do you have thoughts, Costas?
No comment right now.
Okay. So anyway, we can go through the next few weeks with interim measures and be thinking about what may come next.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Yep. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
I'm watching you.
Okay, I'm stopping the recording that I started late. So.
Did you start